So today I'm your host, Trisha Ari, Senior Director of Operations at Square One Engineering. Today we have founder and managing director of Square One Engineering, Travis Smith. You may have seen him on podcasts such as MedTech Snapshot and the Business Wingman Show. He comes to us with 20 years of MedTech experience, has ran multiple associations in Orange County, and currently sits as an advisory board member with an AI startup. He was recognized as a 40 under 40 honoree by the Greater Irvine Chamber of Commerce, and most recently is celebrating a decade of Square One Engineering servicing the MedTech community. But before I turn this over to Travis, as a reminder, we'll have Q&A at the end of the presentation. There's a Q&A section up on top where you can ask your questions or you can raise your hand and we'll make sure that we call you and answer any questions that you may have. But now, I'd like to turn this over to my friend and business partner, Travis Smith.
Well, thank you, Trisha. Everyone, I'm really looking forward to jumping into our content today. So just a quick agenda for what you can experience over the next kind of 30 to maybe 35 minutes. We'll start off with defining our problem as it relates to tribal knowledge and how to secure that moving forward. We're also going to look at some case studies and then highlight some areas where utilizing a couple hand-picked solutions that we've identified can help solve this problem. And then at the end, of course, we'll look at implementation. So to reiterate a comment Trisha had just mentioned, at the very end, we'll have about 10 minutes, give or take, to do some Q&A. So let's jump into looking at our problem. When tribal knowledge itself, when it exits a medical device operation, both startups and strategics, it creates a situation that I refer to as corporate amnesia, which really results when there's an unnecessary loss of productivity and business continuity risk then starts to come into play. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by looking at actually defining what tribal knowledge is and its impact within our business. So I'm sure you all have heard these other terms before, legacy knowledge and institutional knowledge, but I think the biggest takeaway here when we look at what tribal knowledge is, it's unwritten and undocumented information, which really is a big piece of that how-to story within our operations. So look at it this way, from an example perspective. When we're developing a product, the decision-making process along the way, that context, the rationale that goes behind it, workarounds, these are all things that make up the term tribal knowledge. So now as we look at what actually this looks like in our day-to-day, we'll start off with R&D. And as we're going through each of these examples, what I want you to think about is the missing context, intent, or justification that would be missing or would not show up within our normal documentation. So within R&D, you have your legacy designs, understanding the intent as to how those products were developed. Oftentimes that information can be missing. When we move over to our RA/QA partners, one of the things that I see quite often is the routine in which the team, the department, or the company goes through to prepare for an audit. A lot of times that information is missing. As we get into manufacturing, a really popular one is just the little nuances our assemblers and operators would use from an assembly tricks perspective to make sure that their output is meeting the KPIs. And last but not least, another fun one, just from an overall operations perspective, it's amazing how few organizations have their hiring practices documented. And a good way to kind of think about this is, what RA may be doing in terms of their hiring process, oftentimes is very different than what manufacturing may do or what marketing may do. And these practices a lot of times are not documented, which then leads to issues, which we'll cover here in a moment, having to do with tribal knowledge. So, I think at the end of the day, why are we all here? It's because we all recognize to some degree that tribal knowledge either at some point in our career has walked out of the door or it's actually happening right now. And so what we're hoping to do today is solve that problem so it's no longer walking out the door. I really think the two biggest offenders of how tribal knowledge walks out the door, first is employee resignations or terminations. So the best way to look at this is just, it's such as life. People move on, but when they move on, the knowledge that they hold within their heads, that tacit knowledge or tribal knowledge, that has a habit of walking right out the door with them. Part of employees moving on also has to do with retirements. So there's this term, this is not a new term, that's called silver tsunami, and it refers to our baby boomer generation. And a paper that had come out maybe about a year ago was referencing this term from the Wall Street Journal. And what had referenced was that 10,000 baby boomers will be retiring every day from 2024 through 2027. So if you do the math on that, that's an incredible amount of people that are leaving the workforce. So I think lastly, some of our employees, and certainly none of us on this Lunch and Learn, they just love to do rework. I've seen this time and time again. And I think it's one of the things that we need to be careful of, which is how often do we have our folks that work for us they just can't find work, or they don't like the work that's there. And so they end up reworking that same initiative, process, document, however you want to refer to that. That rework is also another way that tribal knowledge walks out the door. So if you're like me, I think a lot of times I make decisions, unfortunately, based on dollars and cents. And so the stat that I'm going to throw up here in a moment, I think, if anything, is probably one of the biggest reasons as to why we want to seriously start looking at this problem. So the cost in loss of productivity, as well as the result of tribal knowledge leaving our door, if you work for a strategic, on average, that cost is $47 million annually. So we're going to break that down here in a moment in terms of some of the bigger areas and how that cost can drive. Now, granted, if you're in a startup, it's certainly not going to be $47 million, but it's still a big cost. So from an impact perspective, as we think about that cost we just went over, when this knowledge walks out the door, it's really amazing how much of an impact that can have on both the organization and the team. One of the things that an organization, International Data Corporation, or IDC, that they found is knowledge workers, our engineers, have a habit at times of spending upwards of 30% of their time researching for information that has somehow magically gone lost within an organization. So if you take our 47 million plus the loss here in just efficiencies, these two are probably the biggest drivers as to why we need to take this problem seriously. As you look at some of these other items, the employee onboarding process is another area where this missing information, that really makes or breaks the new hire's experience and their ability to be successful. So if you think about it this way, when you bring in a new hire, if that person can't find data, is struggling to get the right data, you already have somebody right out the gates, your new hire, who's immediately off to an unfavorable start. So as we kind of look through some other parts of the organization, getting into quality, the impact in this area of our business from a compliance perspective is, being able to go in and truly understand the aftermath of your audits and the information that kind of brought you into, why were those findings occurred, whether it's a minor or a major. What other non-compliance do you have going on? Process deviations is a fun one that seems to come up quite often. So when we think about all of this in the context of tribal knowledge, we really want to continue to think about it this way, which is, how do we really get things done? Yes, within our organizations, we all have SOPs in place, but it's amazing if you ever actually do a self-audit of your SOPs, you'll find that a fair amount of your organization or employees tend to have little tips and tricks or best practices on how they really get things done versus what's in the SOP. And last but not least, also want to talk real quick about our marketing folks and R&D, because when we look at the invention side of our business, which traditionally falls in these two camps, the first place my mind goes to is the loss of innovation. As tribal knowledge walks out the door, so does our problem-solving capacity, as well as the historical insight for how we develop products, why we develop products, and so forth. So we spent a moment earlier highlighting the financial implications, which comes along with our problem here. There's another interesting area that drives this problem, which is turnover. And so we're going to dive into that in a moment, because that's actually part of our solution. SHRM, which stands for the Society of Human Resource Management, they estimate that the replacement cost of an employee can go anywhere from 50% to 250% of their annual compensation. And obviously, that's depending on their role and expertise. So what we're going to do real quick is we're going to look at a calculator to really kind of bring this pain point home on how turnover costs, as well as our tribal knowledge going out the door, impact the organization. So for example, let's take a lead that we have within our organization. What we have on here is a principal engineer. In my most humble opinion, $160,000 I think is probably on the low side for a principal here in Orange County. But if we use 160 and then we take SHRM's insights, what we learn is that when that person walks out the door, we're looking at a minimum an $80,000 cost to the operation, just if we use the low baseline of 50% based on SHRM's analytics. So again, the reason why we're going over this is because I think it's incredibly important for us to understand the dollars and cents that go behind some of these issues that you could argue tribal knowledge really brings about in our organization. So let's actually take a moment and look at who's doing this stuff right. There are lots of examples. I have intentionally chosen large organizations because they oftentimes have more dollars to put to programs like this. As you can see on your screen here, NASA has a program called Appel. This program came about because of the Challenger situation back in 1986. And really, the whole program's focus is to really be driving a culture of lessons learned after every major event, along with advancing formal and kind of on-the-job training. So what you see here, you're going to see this through some of the other examples here today, which is lessons learned, best practices, and training. That tends to be quite the popular approach companies will take to address these issues, which tribal knowledge has a habit of producing. We also have GE, again, another example, which is their Corporate Executive Council program. The big focus here is developing internal expertise through thought leadership, job rotation, and mentoring. Its aim here really is to build, if you want to think about it this way, a bench of highly capable leaders, which also coincides with GE's succession plan strategies. And we're going to get into succession planning here in just a bit. So my favorite example here in this deck, and again, there are lots of examples, is Caterpillar. Caterpillar is a global construction and mining organization. And back in 2012, they were faced with their first wave of the silver tsunami. They had estimated back then that they had roughly about 1,000 employees that were going to be retiring every year for a period of 5 years. So to deal with this problem, what they did was they brought in a consulting firm to build an internal knowledge system, or database, if you will, and they referred to that as the Knowledge University. So my takeaway from looking at a program like this is two things. One, it has a high focus on human-to-human interaction. They're not solely just relying on, like we would today, for example, relying on AI to try to capture all this data. There are engagement programs, people recognition programs that are a part of really a bigger initiative like what you're seeing here today. But what I'll tell you, their secret sauce for Caterpillar with the Knowledge University was they got their C-suite and executive leaders involved early and involved all the way through the process. And as a result, they ended up reducing employee turnover by 8% globally as a result of this program. So it's interesting when we look at something like this, they went into it trying to address the silver tsunami. And as a result, they actually addressed a bigger problem within the organization, which is just general turnover. All right, so the remainder of our time today is going to be spent doing two things. One, talking about a solution, and then two, how do you actually implement it? And that implementation part of it is really going to focus on looking at your environment, and we'll get into that in a moment. And what I mean by environment is the solutions that you're going to see here may be applicable for a startup and might not be applicable for a strategic, and vice versa. So one of the things you'll want to do is make sure that as you're taking this content in, you're digesting it in a way that's appropriate for your size business. So to really build a successful capture system focusing on tribal knowledge, there's three areas that I believe are the primary focus we've got to look at, which is culture, process, and technology. So starting off with business culture, I really look at that. It's kind of a fluffy term at times where, it's really the mindset and the behaviors of the way people think, act, and collaborate within an organization. So the hard part with looking at this kind of a solution is there's just so many things we can consider. But I really do believe that there are two in particular that will make the biggest impact to solving our tribal knowledge issue. One, starting with employee turnover, which we've already been discussing. The second is going over quality leadership. And we'll get into that here in a moment. So what causes employee turnover? We've already been getting into this a little bit, but here's the thing. There seems to be a really big misconception as to why employees leave an organization. Anytime I've found myself in this type of a discussion, it's amazing how people will almost always go to compensation. The list you're looking at here is a ranked list in order of the most common occurrence as to why an employee is going to leave your organization. Take notice of what is in the first slot. So secondarily, I really think we need to look at items like career growth and culture fit, which we'll do here in a moment, because again, you just can't have great leadership, but then not have some of these other items underway. They all kind of end up having an impact with one another. So I think at the end of the day, it's one thing to see a problem, it's another thing to actually be able to fix it. And for starters, looking at the way that our management team is aligned and working together, really ensuring that the approach within the culture, communication, is supportive of the employee and not perhaps antagonistic to the employee. So if you want to fix turnover, and maybe starting off with a benchmark, if your turnover is higher than 8% per year within your organization, you have a problem. So how do you fix it? The items that you're looking at here are ways that are pretty popular. The employee recognition programs, that's a very popular approach that people will usually take. You also have extra training. It's another popular approach. The one that I particularly love are stretch assignments and special projects. That's a great way to give people within your organization opportunity to kind of scale up and take on new roles, learn. All of that typically comes back to addressing employee turnover. Another interesting thing that I've seen people do is, I'm sure everybody in this discussion today has heard of exit interviews, but there's another approach you could do called a stay interview, which is taking employees that you have and interviewing them to just point blank ask them, why is it you continue to work here? If this is done in the right manner, I think that you'll find the information that you get is really insightful to understanding trends as to why people continue to work for you, or perhaps on the inverse, why people are leaving. So to get into the quality leadership side of this piece, and again, we're addressing culture as our first pillar here. I'm of the opinion that the subject of leadership and its impact on culture and the tribal knowledge discussion we're having today, this is tough because this discussion here, thousands of books have been written on it. I mean, you could literally just go anywhere on Google and find a seminar having to do on how to be a better leader. So what I'm trying to do here is overly simplify this because this content is just enormous. I think at the end of the day, if we want to have leaders that are striving to be good quality leaders, some of the things that you'll see that comes up as it relates to behavioral practices are, these folks, they provide the why and the intent behind what they're doing or what the organization is doing, especially when it comes to big decisions that have been made. Of course, they lead by example. One of the other items that I see quite often, it's one of the things that we hold true in our organization here, is upholding a high yet reasonable bar of performance. This is an interesting little nuance because if an organization allows underperformers, it has this interesting effect on your high-end performers, which is they end up leaving the company. Again, driving tribal knowledge issues. So we're going to move on from culture now, and we're going to look at process, really as the second part of our solution in developing ways to deal with our tribal knowledge escape, if you will. So while there are dozens of things that we can consider from a quote unquote process perspective, I believe that there's two that's worth our time today in talking further through, which is succession planning and workforce development. The succession planning concept or idea is really interesting. Other people will refer to this as business continuity planning. But the way I want everybody to think about this in the event you haven't been through this before is a good succession plan is really about ensuring your organization can continue to operate smoothly when key people either leave, retire, or move into new roles within the organization. So for the sake of brevity, I'm not going to cover all 6 of these steps, but I am going to highlight 2 in particular, starting with step 3. When we look at, how do we identify the key individuals that we're going to do a succession plan for? I think there's 3 areas we need to look at for that purpose. The first one is anybody who is business critical, meaning they directly affect revenue. So an executive salesperson, a senior salesperson, client relationships, or compliance. All of those people that fall in that bucket should probably have a succession plan done on their behalf. Knowledge-heavy individuals. So anybody that requires, think about it this way, like really deep institutional or technical expertise in order for them to facilitate their job, that's somebody who should have a succession plan. And then last but not least, anybody within your organization that would be considered hard to replace. So in the SHRM example we gave earlier, we had referenced that for a principal level person, it could take 6 to 9 months to replace that individual. That might be somebody that you would want to consider having a succession plan done for proactively. So as we move into step 4 here, I want us to look internally first. I think that's really important. When we're looking at the idea of identifying the next wave of talent, it's always really important to look internally first to see who shows that capacity for leadership, technical ability, or even initiative. From there, one of the techniques you could use to further evaluate those individuals would be a 9-box grid. Some people might refer to that as a performance versus potential matrices. So the key thing here in step 4, don't just do it for that first level or the primary individual. Try also spending time with a secondary lineup or successor, if you will, to further reduce the risk that these individuals leaving your organization might pose to the company. So as a part of your succession plan, just as more of a quick note here, You really want to meet with these people in person if you can, and document their know-how. By going through that process, that's what's going to help us obtain the tribal knowledge that we're seeking to grab and protect moving forward. So, you of course can use your standard procedures, SOPs, playbooks, and checklists during this process. One of the things I personally love is something that's a little bit more hands-on. For example, doing a knowledge transfer session or a shadow program. I've even seen where organizations have had senior engineers, as an example, get up and give a town hall presentation on things that they've learned as they're going through the product development lifecycle. So these are really interesting ways that we can garner favor with our employees to make sure that they feel great about this experience and not fearful by the fact that they might be losing their job because now all of a sudden the organization is doing some new initiative that they're really not sure what the real reason is behind it. So moving into workforce development, again, this is another one of those topics where there's just an endless amount of things both large and small companies can do when it relates to workforce development. So the list that I have here in front of you all, I've seen organizations do most of this, but one of the trends that you'll see with these approaches and practices, at least today, is that most of them are digitalized. So a little pro tip, if you're looking at your programs or initiatives as it relates to workforce development, I'd highly recommend trying to get rid of manual handwritten processes moving forward. Kind of low-hanging fruit, cheap example, but think lab notebooks, for example. Lab notebooks, while effective in the moment, have a habit of getting lost over a period of time. When that notebook gets lost, so does all of that information, content, and context along the way. One of the examples I wanted to provide here in terms of an organization that really has an interesting program is Medtronic. My guess is most of you are probably going to be familiar with this particular program. At the bottom there, you'll see the Bottlenecks Society. In my opinion, a program like this is kind of the gold standard for where a company potentially can get to. In the event you're not familiar with that particular reward and recognition program through Medtronic, the Bottlenecks Society, it's an award which really highlights and honors key technical folks within the organization for really breakthrough technical achievements. So to be clear, this is not, hey, you showed up every day for 10 years, you didn't call out sick, you're going to get an award. These really are huge technical breakthroughs, de novo breakthroughs, for example, and the organization is then recognizing them for that. So as we continue to talk about our solutions in the area within the organization where I believe we need to focus, technology is our third pillar to that solution set. So one of the things to keep in mind here about technology is, when knowledge itself sits on the shelf, ultimately it's useless. So we really need to make sure as we're moving forward in this part of the discussion that all data as it goes into our technology, our systems, our tools, it has to be useful. So for this reason, what you're going to see coming up here is I really recommend you consider and look at tools that you already have within your organization. This way, the adoption process is that much better as you move forward. For example, we can kind of pick on Jira. Jira is a really good tool that you potentially could look at, or any other workflow tool to collect your tribal knowledge data and then put it into one place where your team or your organization can access it. And within Jira, for example, you can create workflows, or even as they refer to it as boards, where that sole purpose is your institutional knowledge kind of repository, if you will. So there are, of course, other options. You could look at your EQMS, for example. I know Greenlight Guru offers a module that's called the Document Management Workspace module. that might be a good place to consider putting your tribal knowledge, regardless of what tool you use, but mostly if you consider your EQMS. A little pro tip here, I highly, highly recommend you keep separate systems, one that's an audit version ready and one that's for an internal use purpose. A lot of that can be done through the data reporting function. So as we get into the back end of our discussion here today, we're going to real quick go through what it might look like to implement some of these solutions. So step one, I really think it really starts off with, well, we got to understand what we're dealing with and what type of knowledge we're actually trying to collect. So you need to do a knowledge audit. That's the very first thing. And what should come of that is you should understand clearly what type of knowledge it is that you're trying to get, and then how risky is it to your organization? Because that type of data, that's the data you're going to have to go after first in order to ensure that from a business continuity perspective, things are moving forward and you're reducing risk. Step two, from an implementation perspective, of course, we've got to choose a tool. I highly recommend not utilizing Microsoft Word. There's no traceability within documents like that, or at least no good traceability. But the other piece too is, as a part of our system, we really need to incorporate the best that we possibly can, human-to-human processes. These would look like things like mentorships, cross-functional training roundtables. I had mentioned earlier the storytelling idea. Regardless of what it is, it needs to be done in a way that is accessible and becomes part of your operating rhythm moving forward on a daily basis. Last but not least, regardless of the size of your company, I would highly recommend everybody implement the AAR program within your organization if you are not doing this today. And really what it is, the after action reviews, it's a postmortem on big activities where we're going through and we're asking ourselves, either as a team, as a business unit, or an organization, the 4 questions that are here to better understand and document the tribal knowledge that oftentimes comes up as a result of some of these bigger institutional decisions and outcomes. Hang in there, folks. We're almost there. So step 3, really when we look at organizing, I had talked a moment ago, organizing technology, the adoption, it's going to be a lot better if you can utilize tools you already have. So you see a couple examples here on your screen. At the end of the day, the tool that works best for you is the tool that your employees already know and are used to utilizing. Simplicity is the key here. Another pro tip in terms of utilizing tools is, one, you're going to have to offer training. So be thinking through how you can really get people engaged in your organization to want to make this as a part of their daily operation. And then last but not least, larger organizations, when they're bringing in a big initiative, like a digital transformation initiative, a new CRM, a new ERP, it's very common for them to create a super user group. I've also heard the term tiger team. And really what this is it's either a collection of people or an individual that really is the champion internally within the organization to help ensure the adoption and use of that new initiative moving forward is successful. And one piece as it relates to technology and the way we store data, I kind of thought this was a funny example. So if we put ourselves in the shoes of a new employee, how are they going to find data within your tool? Well, what we don't want to do is label a file, for example, as Joe's retirement video, right? Maybe Joe was retiring and you on camera videotaped him and collected all of his tribal knowledge. Well, guess what? That's not going to be findable, if you will, within your tool. It's better to create file names based on the problem you're solving. That way we can find that data a little bit easier. And what that might look like would be how to calibrate XYZ piece of equipment. The last part of our implementation, we have to go back and really look at culture. So one of the things that you'll see comes up in this discussion of tribal knowledge is knowledge hoarding. The best thing you can do to get people engaged and remove that fear is to communicate, communicate, communicate. And that has to go from the top all the way down through the organization. And I think in closing, as we really look at, the summary of kind of what we've covered here today, some of these low barrier approaches like turnover, addressing turnover, or doing succession planning in best practice programs, that's something any size organization can do, regardless if you're a strategic or a startup. Obviously, at the end of the day, I'm of the opinion that you have to have your executives involved from the beginning and throughout the journey in order to ensure success, because that in of itself, along with good communication, has a habit of quelling fears within the organization that people might lose their job as a result of this new initiative.